Hey guys, Tyler Ansman here with Tyler Ansman Performance. So today we're going to talk about KPIs and their relevance to the training and development of elite performers. All right, so KPIs exist in pretty much all field, and it stands for key performance indicators. All right, and basically it allows us to guide our training and development programs if we use them correctly. All right, so it allows us to compare ourselves and our athletes to high performers in the field. All right, so by their very nature, these are the averages of high performances, but they can allow us to see our strengths and weaknesses. The problem tends to arise when we try to apply these too rigidly, right? Like everybody needs to have a 400-pound squat to throw 90 miles an hour, right? That just may not be the case for everybody because each athlete is going to develop differently, making some KPIs a poor indicator for them. So it's important to understand the why behind these KPIs so that we can develop kind of bandwidths and choose to develop different athletes in different ways, kind of as their specific situation necessitates. So why are KPIs important then if we can't rigidly apply them to everybody? Well, there are kind of certain norms and patterns that all high-level throwers possess, right? None of them are striding with their ipsilateral leg, right? None of them are throwing with a fully extended elbow as cricket bowlers do, right? There are certain kind of bandwidths that they're all going to fall into, all right? So while it is a composite of elite performers and by definition general, right? As more data is accumulated, we can make these KPIs kind of more specific to our populations, right? So for example, some high velocity throwers are going to have, relatively longer or shorter strides for their height than some others, right? But we know that for the most part, per kind of Glenn Fleisig's research, that pretty much every high velocity thrower is going to fall with a stride length between 80 and 90% of their height. All right, so we can kind of use this, and if somebody falls way outside of this on one end or the other and they're having issues with performance, then we may have a place to look and possibly address. While we're not going to cover all of the mechanical KPIs of high velocity throwing, we're going to go over a couple as examples. So the first one is lead knee extension angle. All right, so you've probably seen, whether it's social media, YouTube, wherever, people looking at Justin Verlander and being like, that's the lead leg block for everybody. Everybody needs to look like him and have that exact kind of still frame. And I'm going to tell you why that's not really the case if you understand what the lead leg block is actually meant to do. All right. So we do know from research that a greater knee extension angle between max external rotation and ball release is associated with higher ball velocity. All right. But it's really kind of a sliding scale between knee flexion and knee extension. It doesn't really tell us, exactly how much we need because it's not telling us anything about specific athletes, right? So we need to know how much range of motion did that guy have, how much reactive strength, all these kinds of things. So one of the big things is how lax or like hypermobile or how stiff or immobile is this athlete, right? The more lax guys, right, are going to have to go a little bit farther to take slack out of the system, which is really what we're trying to do. All right, and so they're going to have a greater knee extension angle, generally speaking. And the more stiff guys are not going to have to go as far to take slack out of the system. So they're going to have generally not as great of a knee extension angle. All right, and that's kind of just fitting to what they need. All right, so what does the lead leg block really need to do? It needs to stop, right, forward momentum abruptly. It needs to resist deformation, and it needs to redirect energy against the direction of the throw, transferring that energy into the upper body. All right, so this is one of the reasons that knee extension angular velocity may actually be kind of a better thing to kind of base this off of than just knee extension angle in and of itself. All right, so really, knee extension is a symptom of what's happening, right? Because if we don't stop, resist, and redirect well, we're going to tend to see a greater knee flexion angle. All right, and that's really where it becomes problematic, not necessarily in how much we have, but in that we're not transferring energy into the upper body. All right, so this is why it's really important to understand principles and not get caught up in what a specific elite performer, who is by definition generally an outlier, may look like. All right, understand the principles, and then you can build around that. So the next kind of piece of the mechanical KPIs worth talking about is hip-shoulder separation. All right, so hip-shoulder separation is something you've probably heard of, but really all it is the temporal difference between peak pelvis rotation angular velocity and peak upper torso rotation angular velocity. All right, so the time difference between these two kind of helps amplify the energy as it moves through the body, right? So if body segment movement is well-timed and sequenced, the force produced by the whole is greater than the sum of the parts of the individual segments, right? So this is really what it means by like maximizing the kinetic chain. All right, so average upper torso angular velocity during arm acceleration is associated with higher ball velocity, and this can be enhanced if we kind of optimally use hip-shoulder separation. All right, but so the separation of these two segments kind of places a stretch on the fascia, right, from the hip to the shoulder, or the fascia and other elastic elements. All right, and if we optimally time the release of this stretch with the muscular contraction, we can increase the speed, right, of upper torso rotation. But more is not better, kind of in like a general sense. It's really, you know, on a sliding scale, similarly to the lead leg block, right? The more lax guys are going to have to go further to kind of create that stretch and that separation between the two. Whereas the more stiff guys probably aren't going to have to go as far to get kind of the elastic return they're looking for. So more isn't necessarily what should be chased, but kind of optimal, the optimal amount of stretch and the optimal timing of release, kind of timed to that muscular contraction, is really what we're after. So this is kind of how, again, if you don't understand the principles behind what we're trying to do with the hip and shoulder separation, you can get kind of lost in just kind of chasing the most possible. Okay, so the final piece that we'll discuss is layback. All right, so this is something that's kind of talked about frequently, right? If you've ever seen the pictures of Billy Wagner with his arm kind of parallel to the ground, that's what we're talking about. And that's kind of, I think, one of the reasons, kind of same deal with the still images of the lead leg, that people think that, you know, more on, you know, an individual scale even is better. We have seen through the research that generally the higher velocity throwers are closer to about 180 degrees of layback, where the lower velocity throwers are closer to 165. And this makes sense for a lot of reasons. I mean, you know, when we have deeper layback or greater layback, we have kind of a greater distance over which force can be applied to the baseball, and we also get a greater stretch on those elastic elements, which can lead to kind of higher velocity of internal rotation. So, you know, this can be an important piece to this, but it is, again, still important to remember, I keep going back to this, but the stiff versus more lax athletes, so where they're going to be able to even get to kind of place a stretch on those elastic elements. Now, the stiff guys may not go as far, and that may mean they get a little bit less elastic return, but that still may be optimal for them, right? If they go too far, they're going to be outside of their optimal length-tension relationships, and it's going to cause other problems anyway. All right, so they may be able to do some work to kind of get a little bit more range, get a little bit more strength in those end ranges, that kind of thing, and kind of change that length-tension relationship. But without doing that, again, the more stiff guys are generally going to not go as far, and the more lax guys are generally going to go a little bit farther. So there's a couple considerations within this. You know, when we talk about the distance over which force is applied in baseball, longer-armed guys, they don't need to get as deep of layback to still apply force over a pretty great distance. So it may be less of an issue for them. The shorter limb guys, they need to do everything they can, generally speaking, to get as much as they can out of their body, because they have, you know, a greater disadvantage to start with. That doesn't mean this should be chased if they're incapable of getting there, but it may be worth examining at least. Another important consideration is kind of the age that people started throwing consistently at. If they weren't young enough when they started consistently throwing, they may not have certain adaptations that happen at the shoulder that allow them to get to these deep end ranges, and it may limit them. So if you start throwing very consistently kind of before, you know, the growth plates close, you tend to get more kind of humeral retroversion and torsion happening, which just means you're kind of biased towards external rotation. You get deeper external rotation range of motion, more layback, that kind of thing. If you start throwing too late, depending on the growth plate status, it's just not going to happen. So chasing that range of motion is only going to take you so far. You're just going to be physically incapable of getting to the points that some other athletes are. So this is all worth considering, kind of why more external rotation may be valuable, how we go about getting it, and kind of factors worth considering when you're kind of examining it on an individual athlete level. So it's important to kind of think about when we're looking at any kind of KPIs, to think about what makes us, you know, special, unique, whatever, right? We all have different, you know, anthropometrics, nervous systems, primary muscle fiber types, that kind of stuff, that makes us different than other athletes. So, you know, me trying to say, oh, I want to look like and throw like a Roldis. Like that maybe doesn't happen. One, he's 6'4". Two, he's definitely much more fast twitch than I am. And three, his mobility is off the charts, right? So we're not the same. So maybe there's certain elements that I can learn from him, but trying to just model myself totally off of him is probably not the best way to go. All right. So the other thing to remember is you can't excel at everything. All right. So to think that like, oh, my layback is going to be elite, and my back leg kind of pattern is going to be elite, like everything is going to be perfect, like is probably not going to happen. We want to make sure that we can develop our weaknesses to a point where they no longer limit our other qualities, but where we really get better is we develop our strengths into an elite level quality, right? If you're okay at everything, right, decent velocity, decent command, decent off speed, you're never going to be able to play at the highest level, right? Mariano Rivera made a whole career off of basically one pitch, but it was an elite pitch, all right? So develop your strengths to the point where they become elite, and make sure your weaknesses don't limit those other qualities, right? But focusing on weaknesses totally to the exclusion of everything else is probably not a wise choice, right? This is something they talk about at Altus pretty frequently. You're not going to turn, right, Carl Lewis into Maurice Green or Ben Johnson, right? They're different types of athletes, and if you tried to, we'd probably make him worse, right? So keep in mind what makes certain athletes special, and let's make sure that's always present. Okay, so this is kind of the idea behind vertical integration, is that we can keep every single quality present, and it's a matter of what gets the most focus throughout a given time period, cycle, whatever. So we generally will have kind of 1 to 2 big rocks that we're focusing on. Let's develop those, and let's maintain everything else. All right, so kind of another way to look at this is like Jeurys Familia. He may not have kind of elite level arm action, right? But he still throws 100. But what he does do very well is he has a very good lower body, and he's listed at 6'3", 240, so he's got elite level size as well. So he's not going to be great at everything, but he doesn't necessarily need to. He still gets the results that we're kind of after. He throws 100 and he has success at the big league level, right? So it's kind of important to remember also when we're looking at a complex movement pattern like throwing, that when we're working on one piece of the pattern, we're never working on that in isolation. It's going to have downstream effects, and we need to be cognizant of that. This is the other reason for kind of working on 1 or 2 things at a time, so that if it has a negative consequence somewhere else, we can go back and change this pretty quickly. It's pretty clear what we did wrong, and we can go back and kind of fix that somewhat more simply. Whereas if we're working on everything at once, right, we're going to have problems figuring out what caused the issue. All right, so it's important to remember that KPIs are kind of like a roadmap for athlete development, right? They're not the whole picture. You need to have a deep understanding of a lot of different topics, but specifically the movement that you're training, or the kind of the field that you're in, and then everything kind of around that. And if you understand principles, right, it's much easier to kind of take what's important and kind of leave everything else off to the side, right? If we don't understand principles, we get kind of caught up in unimportant pieces, and we likely kind of run too many of our athletes' development in the wrong direction, when we really could be helping them much more if we understood the principles better. Thanks for watching. If you got any comments or questions, drop them below, and give me a subscribe. Thanks for watching.